It's hard to believe this happened just over a year ago, but I still think about that day every time I close my eyes. Zayn Malik, 22, wasn't your typical young man full of dreams and freedom. No, he carried burdens that most men twice his age would crumble under. Living in Dearborn, Michigan, in a modest two-bedroom apartment, Zayn worked nearly every waking hour, halal grocery store at night, Uber during the day, and online college squeezed in between. His mother, Khadijah, was fighting for her life with late-stage cancer, and his 17-year-old sister, Aliyah, had her eyes set on medical school. But dreams cost money, and money was something Zayn barely had. Debt collectors rang his phone like clockwork, and he counted change to buy groceries. He was tired, not just physically but in his soul, the kind of exhaustion that made your bones feel hollow. Every decision he made was to protect the family that was slowly slipping through his fingers. Zayn didn't party. He didn't date. His life was a cycle of sacrifice, duty, and quiet desperation. People in the community called him a good son, but they didn't see him break down in the shower when the water drowned out his sobs. They didn't see his hands shake when he handed over his last $20 for his mother's medication. That day started like so many others. Gray skies, empty pockets, and a hunger that wasn't just in his stomach. Around midday, Zayn stopped by a local tea shop he rarely had time or money to visit. The place was run by a quiet Pakistani family and was known for its $1 chai, served in old mismatched mugs. Zayn reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, barely enough for a small cup. As he waited, he felt something strange, eyes on him. He looked up and saw a woman, older, elegant, sitting across the room. She wore a flowing black abaya and a diamond-studded hijab pin that sparkled under the dim light. Her gaze was intense, almost haunting. Before he could look away, she stood up and walked toward him. Her posture was regal, each step calculated. "Are you Zayn Malik?" she asked, her voice low but unwavering. He blinked, confused and a bit wary. "Yes," he replied hesitantly. She nodded slowly, almost like she had been waiting for that confirmation. "I know what you're going through," she said. Zayn froze. He didn't recognize her, had never seen her before, yet her words cut through him like a blade. "I'm Safia al-Rahman," she continued. "I lost my husband a long time ago. I've seen the world, but I see something in your eyes. The same sorrow I once carried." Her words left him paralyzed. Then came the proposal. Simple, absurd, life-altering. "Marry me," she said. Zayn thought it was a joke. She had to be at least 70. But when she explained what she'd do for his family, pay off debts, get treatment for his mom, sponsor his sister's education, he didn't laugh. He just stared, because for the first time in a long time, someone wasn't taking from him. Someone was, offering a way out. Zayn left the tea shop that day in a fog, the kind that wraps around your brain and won't let you think straight. He didn't know if Safia was serious, delusional, or some rich widow bored with life and looking for entertainment. But the clarity came later that night, as he sat on the floor beside his mother's bed. She was in pain, barely able to speak, and the pharmacy had just called to say her next round of medication wouldn't be released without full payment. Aliyah sat at the kitchen table with tear-streaked cheeks, reading a message from her school about overdue tuition. That was the moment it all crashed down on him. He wasn't just drowning, he was pulling them down with him. Pride, love, fear, logic, none of it mattered anymore. He wasn't thinking about marriage, romance, or appearances. He was thinking about survival. So 3 days after meeting Safia, Zayn stood in front of an enormous wrought-iron gate, staring up at the kind of mansion he'd only ever seen in Turkish dramas. The doorman greeted him by name. She'd been waiting. The marriage contract was signed quietly in her study with only 2 witnesses and an imam. No wedding photos, no celebrations, just ink on paper, sealing a deal that would change everything. Zayn Malik, the broke son of an immigrant, was now legally married to the richest woman in Dearborn, Safia al-Rahman. The house was something out of another world. It wasn't just big, it was a palace, dripping in chandeliers, Persian, carpets, and staircases that split into wings like rivers parting at a stone. Zayn was given his own suite, his own car, even a clothing allowance. Within a week, his mother's treatment was being handled by a renowned oncologist flown in from Chicago. Aliyah cried when she received her paid tuition confirmation and a new laptop delivered with a note that simply read, "Keep going." On the surface, everything had turned golden. Zane's family finally breathed, and for a while, he let himself believe he'd done the right thing. But inside the mansion, something wasn't right. The staff treated Sophia like royalty, bowing slightly when she entered a room, speaking in hushed tones. And then there was the door, the heavy wooden one on the second floor, always locked, always guarded. Zane asked once about it, only to be told by a stiff-faced servant, "That's the private wing." But what kind of private wing needed 24-hour guards? Sophia herself remained graceful, distant, always poised. She never demanded affection, never intruded on his space, and every evening they ate dinner together as if they were old friends instead of an unlikely married couple. She would ask how his mother was, how Aliyah was doing, and then retire early, disappearing down the hall toward that locked door. It didn't take long for curiosity to start gnawing at Zane's peace. The door became an obsession. Zane didn't understand why. It wasn't like he was forbidden from the rest of the house. He had access to nearly every room, every garden, even a small home theater on the ground floor. But the locked door on the second floor felt like a wall between him and the truth. Every time he passed it, he felt something, like it was watching him, not the other way around. One night, while everyone else slept and the call to Fajr hummed softly from a nearby mosque, he lingered by it, just stood there, hand hovering over the cold brass handle. That's when the guard appeared. "Sir, this area is restricted," he said with the kind of tone that didn't invite follow-up questions. Zane asked why, but received only a polite bow and silence. And yet, the silence behind that door was louder than anything. He began noticing more. Sophia always prayed alone, often right before that door. She never prayed with the household staff, never joined group dhikr. It was subtle but strange, and the more she kept him away from that room, the more he felt like whatever lay behind it was the real reason for everything. Then came Mira. She was the youngest of the household staff, barely 19, and the only one who spoke to Zane like he was human and not some piece of fine china to be handled with care. One afternoon, as she served him tea in the courtyard, her eyes flicked toward the second floor before returning to his face. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly. Zane looked up at her and didn't answer immediately, but her concern was sincere, gentle, without motive. Later that night, he found her in the kitchen and tried again. "Mira," he whispered, "what's behind that door upstairs?" She went pale. I don't know." But Zane saw the lie in her eyes. "You do," he said quietly. "Please don't ask," she murmured. "I could lose everything." He didn't push, but something changed in her after that. She became nervous around him, glancing over her shoulder when they passed in the hallway. A few nights later, she knocked on his door. "She wants to see you," she said, barely above a whisper. "In her chamber. She's waiting." Zane's heart pounded. This wasn't just about the door anymore. Something bigger was unfolding, and he was finally being pulled into it. Zane dressed carefully that night, unsure why his hands trembled as he buttoned the dark blue thobe he had rarely worn. The hallway to Sophia's chamber felt longer than usual, lit only by wall sconces that flickered like old memories. When he knocked, her voice came gently from inside. "Come in, Zane." He entered, unsure of what to expect. The room was unlike any other in the mansion. Tall vases of roses lined the corners, the air thick with their scent. Silken drapes filtered the moonlight into soft patterns across the floor. And there, seated in the center on an elegant chaise lounge, was Sophia. She looked calm, even beautiful in a timeless, haunting way. "I didn't think you'd come," she said with a faint smile. "I had to," he replied, keeping his voice low. "There's too much I don't understand." She gestured for him to sit, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're not here because of your mother or sister," she said. "You're here because of that door." Zane didn't even pretend to deny it. "Yes," he said. "It's been haunting me." Her eyes softened with something between sorrow and nostalgia. "Then it's time you knew everything." She stood and crossed the room to a carved wooden cabinet. From it, she pulled an old photograph and handed it to him. Zane stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of his father, Samuel Malik, young, smiling, dressed in a dated button-up shirt. Standing next to him was a much younger Sophia. "That's your father," she said quietly. We knew each other a long time ago, before he met your mother. Zane's grip tightened on the photo. You knew him. I loved him, she said, her voice suddenly fragile. After my husband died, he was the first man to be kind to me. I mistook that kindness for something else. When I asked him to marry me, he laughed, told me I was just a rich distraction, that I'd misunderstood everything. It shattered me. Her gaze drifted toward the locked door. I buried that pain. For decades. But then I saw you. You look exactly like him. Zane stood, his voice sharp. So you married me. For revenge? No, she said quickly. It started that way. But it didn't stay that way. Her voice cracked. You were nothing like him. You respected me. You were kind when you didn't need to be. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as him. I saw you as you. Zane didn't know what to say. His chest was tight with 1,000 emotions fighting for space. Betrayal, disbelief, sorrow, maybe even pity. So what now? He asked, trying to steady his voice. Safia didn't answer right away. She walked slowly to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small brass key. Tomorrow night, she said quietly, placing it in his hand. After everyone is asleep, go to the locked door. Use this. Don't bring your anger. Don't bring your judgment. Just bring your heart. Zane looked at the key, cold and heavy in his palm. What's behind it? He asked, still unsure if he wanted to know. She looked at him with eyes that had clearly wept more than they had seen joy. The truth, she said simply, and I believe you're ready. That night, Zane returned to his suite with the key clenched in his fist. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, his father's face blurred into Safia's tears, and the mansion, once a symbol of salvation, now felt like a puzzle box he was finally learning how to open. When the hour came, the mansion was shrouded in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense, breathless sort that creeps into the walls after something has shifted. Zane moved quietly through the hallway, the soft patter of his footsteps drowned by the thudding of his heartbeat. The key in his hand no longer felt like metal. It felt like weight, like consequence. At the door, he took a deep breath, slid the key into the lock, and turned it. The click was louder than he expected, final and almost ceremonial. As the door creaked open, he was met with a room frozen in time. Soft golden light spilled in from wall sconces. The air smelled like old rosewater and parchment. A tall cabinet stood against the far wall, next to a chair draped in a worn prayer shawl. In the center was a low table, and on it sat a thick leather folder. Zane walked in, each step feeling heavier. He opened the folder and found photographs, dozens of them. Most were of Safia in her younger years, elegant and vibrant at galas, on trips, smiling with people he didn't recognize. But then, there were photos of her and Samuel, his father, on a picnic blanket, holding hands, laughing like teenagers. Zane's jaw clenched. His father had never spoken of her, never mentioned this chapter. Beneath the photos were letters, some angry, others mournful, all in her handwriting. He picked one up and read, Dear Samuel, I waited for you. Again. Why didn't you come? Was it all a lie? Zane dropped the letter as if it burned. His breath quickened, hands trembling as he stared at the pile of unsent words and forgotten moments. Before he could process any of it, a soft voice spoke from behind him. I used to write to him every week. He turned sharply. Safia was standing in the doorway, draped in a long robe that shimmered faintly in the low light. Her presence was calm, but her voice was barely holding itself together. He never replied, she continued, stepping into the room, as if returning to a memory she had long kept locked away. Not once. I kept this room sealed not out of shame, but because it was the part of me that never healed. Zane could feel the walls closing in. So why trap me in this? He asked, his voice cracking. Why drag me into something I had no part in? Safia didn't flinch. At first it was punishment, she said, her eyes wet but unwavering. I wanted his son to feel the powerlessness I once did. I thought if I gave you everything, but kept control, maybe I'd find peace. But I didn't expect you to be kind. You listened. You respected me. You didn't run. Her voice broke. You made me love again, Zane. And that was never part of the plan. Zane stepped back, as if her confession had physically pushed him. He felt like he was suffocating. buried beneath the weight of a past he never lived and a future that was never truly his. "This isn't love," he said, his voice rising despite himself. "This is guilt, obsession, manipulation." But Safia didn't recoil. She stood still, her hand resting lightly over her heart. "Maybe it was all those things at first. Maybe I was trying to rewrite a story that ended too soon. But somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to replace your father. I started seeing you for who you are." Zain didn't respond. He turned away, eyes scanning the room filled with evidence of a woman's lifelong ache. Then something caught his attention. Tucked under the letters was a legal document. He picked it up and read the header: "Last Will and Testament of Safia al-Rahman," dated just 1 month ago. In it, she had named him the sole heir to her entire estate. Every asset, every business, the house, everything. Zain turned to her, stunned. "You're giving me all of this?" She nodded once. "Not because I want to own you," she said softly, "but because you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. Hope." Zain didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat tightened as if his body refused to let the emotions escape. He clutched the will, but it felt like it weighed more than paper, like it carried decades of someone else's pain, and now it was his to carry. He wasn't sure if what he felt was gratitude, resentment, guilt, or some twisted mix of it all. Safia sat in the armchair by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking every bit like a woman who had finally said everything that had been rotting inside for years. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. "You never had to. But if you do, stay just for tonight." Zain stared at her. There was no command in her tone, no expectation, just a quiet plea. And so, he did. They talked for hours, not as husband and wife, not as the son of a man who broke her heart or the woman who tried to reclaim it, but simply as two people who had carried too much for too long. Zain learned about her childhood in Karachi, about how she built her empire brick by brick after being widowed at 28, about how loneliness grew like mold in the corners of her heart despite the luxury around her. He didn't know how to forgive her. He didn't even know if he should. But in those hours, something shifted. Not everything made sense, but everything finally had context. Weeks passed after that night, and things seemed quieter in the mansion. A strange, unspoken understanding settled between Zain and Safia. There were no more questions, no more locked doors, but fate has a cruel sense of timing. One morning, Safia collapsed in the garden while sipping her tea. The doctors said it was her heart, age, stress, years of carrying invisible burdens. There wasn't much they could do. Zain sat by her bedside every day, reading Quran softly as her breaths grew shallower. She no longer looked like a towering figure of power. She looked human, small, tired, and at peace. On the 4th night, just before Fajr, as the light of dawn spilled gently into the room, she looked at him one last time and whispered, "Thank you for making me feel young again, even if just for a while." And then she was gone. Her face was calm, lips curved into a slight smile. At her janazah, people spoke of her charity, her sharp mind, her business empire. No one knew the weight she had carried or the redemption she had found. But Zain did, and as the wind stirred through the cemetery trees, he whispered under his breath, "I forgive you, Safia. Forgive me too." It wasn't closure, but it was a beginning. But Safia's story didn't end with her burial. Something lingered, like a final page left unturned. In the quiet days that followed, as condolences poured in and the mansion settled into stillness, Zain noticed someone who had always been there but had never truly been seen. Mira, the 19-year-old servant who had guided him that fateful night. She didn't hover or insert herself into his space, but she was present in small, consistent ways. She brought him tea without being asked. She reminded him gently about his mother's medication schedule. She walked lightly, spoke softly, and always bowed her head, not out of submission, but out of understanding. Mira had served Safia loyally for years, yet it became clear that she had also been watching Zain, quietly, respectfully, from the shadows. One afternoon, he found her tending to the garden near the jasmine vines. "You really cared about her, didn't you?" he asked. Mira didn't look up. "She gave me a home," she replied, "but it was you who gave it peace." Zain stood there a long moment, unsure how to respond. Her words echoed inside him more than he expected. In that stillness, something began to shift again. Their interactions grew from fleeting glances to small conversations, and then to longer exchanges over tea in the courtyard. Zane learned that Mira had been orphaned at 10 and raised within the household staff. She had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but life had interrupted her plans with servitude. Unlike Safia, Mira didn't speak with grandeur. She didn't make promises or ask impossible things of him. She simply existed beside him, and somehow that presence grounded him. There was no weight, no tension, just comfort. Zane, who had once viewed the mansion as a prison of obligations and buried memories, now saw it changing. The silence no longer suffocated him. The rooms no longer whispered regrets. Instead, they began to hum with something gentler. When Mira asked if she could convert one of the East Wing salons into a reading space for neighborhood kids, Zane didn't hesitate. "Make it yours," he said. She looked up, startled by the freedom, and nodded with the kind of smile that stays with you long after it fades. It was the first time Zane felt like he wasn't continuing Safia's story. He was finally starting his own. The transformation was quiet, but undeniable. What once was a mansion of echoes and locked memories slowly became something living. The halls filled with light, not from chandeliers, but from laughter and open windows. Zane began using Safia's wealth not to indulge, but to repair. He hired tutors for Mira and registered her in adult education classes. He refurbished parts of the estate into community spaces, a garden for the elders, a library for students, a small clinic offering free checkups in honor of his mother's recovery. He didn't do it to feel noble or make headlines. He did it because he needed to, because turning pain into purpose was the only way he could live with everything that had happened. And Mira was always there. Her role slowly shifted from servant to partner. She wasn't trying to replace Safia or fill a gap. She was simply herself, kind, steady, warm in a way that didn't ask anything of him except presence. Zane found himself seeking her out, not for help or service, but just to hear her speak, to see the way her eyes softened when she smiled, or to catch the way she hummed while pruning roses. It happened slowly, like water, warming over a low flame. One night, after Taraweeh prayers, they walked back together under a silver-lit sky. The mosque lights dimmed behind them as the street lay quiet. "I've been thinking," Zane began, unsure if his voice would betray his nerves. "You've been here through everything. You never asked for anything, not even thanks." Mira looked down, shyly. "I never wanted anything. Just to see you." "Okay." He stopped walking, turned to her. "Would it make you happy?" he asked carefully. "If I asked you to be part of my life?" She didn't speak right away, but her eyes shimmered with something between shock and deep, aching warmth. "You mean?" "Yes," he nodded. "Not out of obligation, not to forget the past, but because when I'm near you, I feel calm, I feel home." Mira's lips trembled as she whispered, "Then yes." Their nikah was held in the same mosque, modest and quiet. No headlines, no cameras, just a circle of close friends, a soft dua for Safia's soul, and a beginning that didn't need anyone's approval but theirs. Married life with Mira was nothing like what Zane had experienced with Safia, and that was exactly what he needed. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was peaceful, consistent, and real. They began every morning with coffee in the courtyard and ended every night reading together from the Quran, or just talking about little things. What herbs were growing in the garden, which neighbors needed groceries, whether to repaint the guest room. Zane, who once felt like a guest in his own life, now felt rooted. His mother's health stabilized, and Aliyah, now thriving in her second year of medical school, visited regularly, bringing laughter and new energy into the home. The mansion no longer echoed with regret. Instead, it vibrated with life. Neighborhood children running through the halls during reading sessions, elders resting under fig trees in the garden, the scent of fresh bread always in the air. Zane had inherited a legacy, yes, but he had reshaped it into something new, something healing. And Mira, soft-spoken but fierce in her devotion, had become the quiet architect of it all. She never tried to change Zane. She simply believed in him, and somehow that was more powerful than any promise of wealth or redemption. Then came the news that would change everything again. Mira was pregnant. Zayn found out one crisp morning when she slipped a small envelope across the breakfast table, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a sonogram and a note that simply read, "Our next chapter." He stared at it in silence, overcome. All the versions of himself, the broken boy who once begged Allah in the dark for a miracle, the dutiful son who sold his soul to save his family, the husband to a woman shrouded in secrets, all of them seemed to dissolve in that moment. What remained was a man being offered something he had never truly dared to imagine, a future. Mira placed her hand over his, and for once, Zayn didn't feel fear. He felt peace, joy, even. Their child wouldn't be born into the shadow of old wounds, but into a home forged through hard choices and quiet resilience. Zayn decided then that he would raise this child to know that sometimes life's strangest detours are actually divine direction. Not everything made sense in retrospect. Safia's love had been messy, painful, complicated, but it had led him here, to love that was quiet, honest, and rooted in mercy. And for that, he was grateful. The mansion evolved again as Mira's belly grew. What was once a symbol of isolation and power now became a home of warmth and preparation. Zayn converted the old music room into a nursery. It had high windows that flooded the space with morning light, and Mira picked soft colors: sage, cream, lavender. He watched her move through the space, her hand gently resting on her stomach, and realized that for the first time, he wasn't building for survival, but for joy. They argued sometimes, about baby names, about who would wake up for night feedings, about whether or not to hire a nanny. But even the arguments felt different. There was laughter in the tension, and apologies came easily. Zayn often thought about Safia during those quiet evenings when he sat assembling cribs or folding tiny clothes. He no longer hated her. In fact, some nights he found himself missing her presence, her mystery, her contradictions. It was strange to mourn someone who had caused so much confusion, but he understood now that pain doesn't cancel out goodness. It lives beside it. And maybe, just maybe, she had given him more than she took. When their daughter was born, the entire house felt like it inhaled and exhaled at once. Mira named her Layla, a name Zayn had mentioned once in passing, saying his mother used to sing an old lullaby by that name. She was tiny, with almond-shaped eyes and a full head of black hair. Zayn held her the first night while Mira slept and whispered prayers over her as she wriggled in his arms. The world outside felt far away. All the noise, the past, the buried grief, it all quieted in the presence of that newborn breath. His mother cried when she held her granddaughter for the first time. Aaliyah, who had once feared she'd have to quit school and give up her dreams, was now Layla's favorite aunt, already spoiling her with storybooks and baby scrubs. Even the mansion staff, many of whom had stayed on after Safia's death, said it felt like the house had been reborn, and in a way, it had. Zayn looked around one day at the courtyard filled with toys, fresh flowers, Quran recitations from the speaker near the prayer room, and realized he had arrived at a life he never dared to wish for. Not through romance, not through wealth, but through endurance, and the grace of being given one more chance. Zayn eventually decided to honor Safia in a way that felt honest, without rewriting history, but also without burying it. He transformed the East Wing, where the locked door once guarded a shrine to her grief, into a library and reflection space open to the public. He called it the Al-Rahman Room of Forgiveness. It held her personal journals, old letters, even the unsent ones to his father. There were photos, travel keepsakes, and a wall that featured the quote she once whispered to him in her final days. "Thank you for making me feel young again, even if just for a while." The community came, curious at first, then reverent. The room didn't hide the complexity of her past. It embraced it. Mira helped organize the exhibits, and Zayn made sure the space also included books for children, quiet nooks for study, and open prayer rugs for anyone needing a moment of reflection. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a monument. It was a space for truth and healing, and somehow, that felt like the most sincere thing he could offer to the woman who had changed his life in ways he still didn't fully understand. As Layla grew, Zayn noticed how much she resembled both sides of his past. The innocence of Aaliyah's youthful ambition and a spark in her eyes that reminded him of Safia's fierce will. One afternoon, while they were playing near the rose garden, Layla pointed toward the library and asked, "Who was Safia?" Zayn paused. The answer wasn't easy, but instead of simplifying her into a saint or villain, he said, "She was someone who made a lot of mistakes but also gave us this place, this chance." Layla blinked, thoughtful beyond her years. "So, she was part of our story?" Zayn nodded. "A big part." That evening, as he tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead, he realized something profound. He no longer carried the weight of what happened as a burden. It had become a thread in the larger fabric of his life, woven in with struggle, love, loss, and grace. And in that fabric, he finally found meaning, not in wealth or revenge, but in becoming the kind of man his father had never had the chance to be, the kind of man who chose peace, who built rather than buried, and who forgave, not just others, but himself. Zayn didn't talk much about the early days, not because he wanted to hide them, but because they no longer defined him. Still, there were moments, usually quiet ones, late at night, when it all came rushing back. The desperation in that tea shop, the cold metal of the key in his hand, Safia's trembling voice in the candle-lit room. Those memories didn't hurt anymore, but they carried weight, the kind that reminded him of how far he'd come. Sometimes, when walking alone through the mansion's halls, he'd pause by the portraits of Safia in her prime, poised, elegant, eyes full of pride and ache. He no longer saw a stranger who had manipulated him. He saw a woman broken by her own losses, who had reached out in the only way she knew how. Forgiveness had changed the shape of her in his mind, softening the edges. And somehow, in forgiving her, he had learned to be gentler with himself too. Not everything made sense. Some questions remained unanswered, but Zayn had learned that peace wasn't about resolution. It was about acceptance, and that, in its own quiet way, was enough. Mira would sometimes catch him staring off into those thoughts and gently bring him back to the present with a touch on his shoulder or a cup of tea. "Still in your head again?" she'd ask with a knowing smile. He'd laugh, nod, and let her presence pull him back into the now, where Layla was giggling in the background, where the sun painted gold across the library windows, and where love no longer wore masks. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real, built not on fairy tales, but on honesty, healing, and choice. Every Friday, they hosted a small community dinner at the mansion. People came, neighbors, students, elders, with laughter and stories and dishes that reminded them of home. Mira, who once served silently in the background, now stood beside Zayn as his equal, beloved by everyone who stepped through their doors. And Zayn, who once felt like a pawn in someone else's game, now felt like a man who had earned his place, not through inheritance, but through intention, through showing up, through staying when it would have been easier to run, through loving, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. There was one particular evening, warm, quiet, the sky brushed with pink and orange, when Zayn found himself sitting in the courtyard with Layla asleep on his chest. Mira was beside him, reading quietly, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing over his arm. A breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and the sounds of distant laughter floated from the back garden where Aliyah and a few neighborhood kids were playing chess. In that moment, Zayn looked around and felt something he hadn't known how to name before. Completeness, not perfection, not closure, but a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He thought back to that first night, the proposal, the bargain that had started everything, and how strange it was that what had once felt like entrapment had led him here. It wasn't a happy ending in the storybook sense, but it was a life, his life, filled with purpose, forgiveness, and unexpected love. The kind of love that doesn't arrive with fire and passion, but grows slowly like roots beneath the surface, steady and unshakable. Sometimes people in the community still whispered about the story behind his wealth, curious about the rumors, the strange marriage, the quiet inheritance. But Zayn didn't feel the need to correct them. Let them think what they wanted. What mattered was that his mother no longer cried herself to sleep in pain, that Aliyah would soon graduate as a doctor, that Mira laughed without looking over her shoulder, that Layla would grow up surrounded by warmth, not silence. Safia al-Rahman's name still carried weight in town, and Zayn made sure that weight was used to serve others, through scholarships, community projects, and quiet donations, no one ever traced back to him. He didn't need credit. He didn't want legacy. What he wanted was peace. And in finally accepting everything, the pain, the loss, the twisted way life had unfolded, he had found it. Not because someone handed it to him, but because he chose to build it, one humble, messy, redemptive brick at a time. The day Layla turned 3, Zayn walked with her through the Al-Rahman room of forgiveness. She held his hand tightly, eyes wide as she looked at the books, the flowers, the quiet reverence of the space. Mira followed. Behind, smiling softly, her hands resting gently on her rounded belly, another child on the way. They paused before the carved stone above the library entrance, where a single quote had been etched permanently into the arch. Love does not always arrive the way we expect, but when it does, it makes everything before it worth surviving. Layla looked up and asked, "Did Safia say that?" Zayn nodded. She did. His daughter didn't understand the full meaning yet, but one day she would. One day she would learn that her father's story wasn't simple, that sometimes love begins in brokenness, that kindness can come from unlikely places, and that even wounds can lead to grace. He hoped she'd see that her life was born not from a perfect past, but from redemption, real, hard-earned, and rare, and that maybe that kind of story was worth telling after all. So no, Zayn's story wasn't one you'd hear in a fairy tale or see in a film. It didn't begin with love, but it ended in it. Not the kind you chase or fall into, but the kind that grows in the aftermath, quiet, deliberate, enduring. A 22-year-old boy once walked into a tea shop with barely enough coins for chai, and he left with a proposal that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and what it means to be needed. Today, he is a father, a husband, a son who fulfilled a promise, a man who once made a deal to survive, but who stayed to heal. And that mansion in Dearborn, once the home of secrets and sorrow, now stands as a sanctuary, not just for him, but for everyone who steps inside. People still ask him why he did it, why he said yes. He never really knows how to answer. All he ever says is, sometimes the hardest roads lead you to the gentlest places. And that somehow is the only truth that matters. Only